Hello, awesomers. It's me. It's your buddy, Steve Simonson. And here we are talking again on the Awesomers podcast. And I realize that I'm doing most of the talking, but I sure appreciate you listening. And I've been pleased when I've been traveling around the world to meet listeners of the Awesomers podcast. And I certainly appreciate hearing the stories of, which episode or words of wisdom helped them, or which joke that they laughed at the most. I don't always get the joke squeezed in, but when I do, oh, they're good. They're pure gold, baby. All right, so let's dig into today's topic. So I had a recent question from a buddy of mine, and I won't name him because I didn't ask him permission, but basically his question was, hey, I'm trying to use a factory in China, and I've heard you, Steve, talk about SinoSure before, and the factory said, we don't know what it is. How does it work? Now, first of all, I appreciate that question from my colleague and friend, because if your factory is telling you something you don't know, that you haven't dealt with, it's like, hey, let's get a little friendly advice. So that's number one. It's like no bad questions, as always. Number two, I rarely trust factories when they say they don't know about SinoSure or they don't know how it works. If they do, let's just assume they're telling the truth. And it's happened. Sometimes that's happened. But it would be because that they are a smaller factory or relatively new. And that in itself, for me, would give me concern, because if they don't have a level of sophistication to know what SinoSure is, which is a state-owned company, it's a state-owned enterprise. They're called SOEs in China, and their entire purpose is to encourage and reduce risk for exporters. So if you're a factory in China and you have an export license, your mission is to try to ship product out. Now, of course, you want to, some of these factories have pivoted to selling domestic, but most factories kind of pick a lane. They either are super into domestic or super into export, and they stay in a lane. Again, there are exceptions to every rule. I know plenty of factories that do both. But all of that said, if you're an exporter of any level of volume, you know who SinoSure is, and you probably know how it works. But today I'm going to break down very quickly for all of my seller friends. If you're buying and importing products, particularly from China, this is how SinoSure works. But I want to make sure that you understand that credit insurance in general works this way, and SinoSure is a credit insurance company. So I'll give some examples of how it works in Europe or other places, even America, Canada, etc. Australia, New Zealand. Like, credit insurance is a process question, not a individual company question. So I'm going to start with how SinoSure works, so that if you're buying in China, you can use SinoSure, or you can instruct your factories how to use it. And then I'll try to branch in how that applies to other countries as well. So firstly, you're the importer, you're the buyer, you're importing, and the factory is largely the exporter. Okay, so you've got an importer and you got an exporter, and you form some sort of trade contract, right? Maybe you've got a 3N agreement with them. Maybe you've got a PO that has all your specifications, and that's your agreement. Whatever your trade contract is, maybe it's just an email that you sent saying, yeah, I like that sample. I'll take 1,000. Those are my least favorite kinds of contracts, everybody. But whatever your deal is, you're the importer, they're the exporter. Now, one of the things that they like is they like cash. Everybody likes cash, but you know what? Sellers realize that the cash that you lay out is problematic. Like, the more cash you have in advance of your sale, the worse off you are. And this is a foundational element of cash flow, right? It's better, for example, if you don't have to pay for this stuff until after you've sold this stuff, right? Wouldn't that make your life a little easier? And so that the question is, well, how long is it going to take you to sell it? And We can't solve that entire problem typically with SinoSure, but you can at least advance part of the problem. And a typical SinoSure deal would be like a net 60 from bill of lading. So getting 60 days from bill of lading will typically cost about 2%. So it's usually about a 0.5% to 1% every 2 weeks, depends on who you talk to. And SinoSure will charge that to be the credit insurance company for the factory, where they will guarantee 80%, generally speaking, of your debt. So let's just say, for the sake of discussion, you've got $100,000 you owe this factory. SinoSure will guarantee 80% of that through their credit insurance, meaning if you don't pay within the 60 days, they can file a claim with SinoSure, and there's a certain right to cure period, let's say 30 days. But beyond that right to cure, then SinoSure will pay out the credit insurance and then attack you to try to get the money. So the principle of credit insurance is that the factory is guaranteed that 80% after 60 days at a minimum, right? Assuming you don't pay them. Now, if you pay them, then everybody just carries on with their life, right? There is one little nuance that some factories go, well, I really need cash. And it's like, well, then go to a factoring company or a bank, and they will take your accounts receivable or the PO, and they will finance that PO at 80%, whatever's insured. So they get that money immediately at the point the bill of lading is created. And they have to pay a little fee for that. And it varies, but right now, China interest rates are lower than other places, or at least competitive with other places. Historically, they've been higher than the Western world, but now it's all kind of coming into a similar form. In fact, they're kind of artificially being held down over there in China at the moment. So the factory says, well, I need the money, which means, okay, well, go to a bank and you can get 80% advance to you at bill of lading for, another, percent or two. Now, the factory may say, well, all of this stuff is, eating at my margin. They may want to make you pay the fees or split the fees or come to some arrangement. I think that's reasonable. I think that, especially when you're starting out, my general posture is, you know what, on the first, shipment or two, we'll take the burden. But let's say the first 3 months, we'll take the burden. The next 3 months, we're going to split the burden. And after that, it's your burden, factory. And that doesn't mean you get to raise the price. It just means you better get more efficient the more of this you make for us. So the cost of this is relatively small. And certainly when you think about the cumulative positive effects of having better cash flow and lower risk, let's just say for the sake of discussion that the factory gets the bill of lading, a bank or a factor, they're called factors. I'm trying not to confuse you, but a factor is somebody who advances money on accounts receivable. This is not to be confused with a factory. So whether it's a bank or a traditional factor, they'll take your PO and they'll go, oh yeah, it's backed by SinoSure at the factory level, so we will go ahead and advance 80%. So now the factory's got cash flow, and they get their 20% once you pay the bill. I won't get into the, who's paying who at this stage because it varies by contract. But fundamentally, most factories just simply say, you know what, I'll just suck up the pain for the 60 days and wait to get all the money then. And so they'll hold the paper themselves. Now, this is a kind of a commercial lending term. Who's holding the paper, right? Who is going to be paid the money? If the factory just says, you know what, I'm going to wait, I'm not going to go to a bank or a factoring company, then they're holding the paper and they're waiting for you to pay. And I highly recommend you pay on time or early. Even a day late could impact your credit insurance coverage. And at the moment that you can't get credit insurance, now the factories have a higher risk. And frankly, if you're not creditworthy, why should they extend you credit, right? That's a pretty fair way to view things. So I would always try to pay them on time. Now, the asterisk next to that is if there is a huge quality issue, then you have to document that and file a claim related to that quality issue. It can't just be, I've had a few complaints, I'm going to hold payment. You got to get into it and create a claim that is well documented, well understood, so that then the factoring company or the SinoSure, whoever's involved at that stage, will know that there's a legitimate dispute taking place, not just you trying to get out of paying. And these are subtleties, but they're quite important, maintaining your credit worthiness. Now, this is, again, in China. SinoSure is a state-backed company, so literally owned by the government. And so they kind of have unlimited capital, and they have, kind of rigid paperwork and processes and things like that. But bottom line is they are generally going to pay out somebody who, let's say, again, somebody places an order and they don't pay, SinoSure will pay that 80% insurance contract with the covered party. So that same principle works in Europe and elsewhere in the world, Australia, America, Canada, doesn't matter where. There are many credit insurance companies, and they basically look up your company, whether it's in Dun & Bradstreet in the Western world or export, customs export records in China. And they determine, well, gosh, what is this company based on their credit worthiness? What are they eligible for us to insure? Because insurance companies know that the fail rate's often very small for them. The risk is quite small, but when they do get a payout or have to make a payout, it could be, substantial. And so their risk management, just like they would with car insurance or house insurance or anything like that. And therefore, the person they're ultimately covering has to be credit worthy. So that's kind of my caveat, is that, like, if you end up paying late or you got bad Dun & Bradstreet, you got to get that cleaned up if you really want to get credit insurance. But if you've ever bought anything in China, let's say you've been in China buying for more than a year, and you've bought more than, let's say, $50,000 or $100,000 out of China, SinoSure already has a file on you, whether you know it or not. And remember that you're not contacting SinoSure directly. The factory would go to SinoSure and get that insurance coverage. And that's what covers them. And that's what they feel better about. And that gives you the flexibility to, get longer terms. Now, there are some limitations to this. Some factories are living hand to mouth. This is a problem for you in any situation, not just of obtaining credit, but if they are so undercapitalized that they can't afford to carry your paper for 60 days, that's a big problem. That's a red flag. And particularly right now, when the situation in China is so tenuous with credit markets and the housing, and their economy is kind of crashing down, that you don't want to be at risk. You don't want to have this problem. And therefore, SinoSure is, a good way to say, well, listen, I understand you guys need cash, so go to a bank or go to a factory and get your 80% advance at the bill of lading, but and get it backed by SinoSure. But you can't put all the risk on me, right? Now, fundamentally, the equation of whether they accept terms or not comes down to very simple mechanics. Number one, do you have good credit worthiness? Do they trust you? Do they have a relationship with you? All of those are factors. But the second bit is, like, can they afford to operate without the cash up front, right? What if they can't get the cash? That liquidity problem is a big, fat, hairy issue for me. And by having conversations about SinoSure, you can suss that out. And maybe that's a reason to look for alternatives right there alone. You do not want factories that are so hand to mouth that one or two bad things happen to them and they're out of business. And I've shared this earlier in the year, perhaps, certainly, and I've done it at an event or two, like the number of factories that are closing down in China related to COVID, related to the housing crunch, related to the credit crisis in China is substantial. Right? It's never before has the amount of companies closing outpaced the companies opening, but that's what's happening right now. So the risk is higher on you right now than it's ever been as a importer, as somebody who's trying to procure products for your brand and bring them in, your risk profile is getting worse and worse, not because of you, but because of that side of the equation. And so I want you to be very cautious and careful about it. So anyway, that's my little SinoSure roundup. I hope it's helpful. You know what you guys could do for me? I rarely ask for this, and I'll probably try to get better at it. But on the YouTubes, I've got a few subscribers, but I've never really tried to rank or anything. But wherever you're watching this, whether it's YouTube's or the I don't know what other places people watch things, but wherever you watch it, go ahead, subscribe, click, share, save. All of that stuff will help spread the awareness of these things. And as I have the time and record more of these, your help in spreading the word is useful because it amplifies the message and helps other sellers get the word as well. So thanks, everybody. I hope you have a great day and happy selling. Bye-bye.